They were three brothers, born and raised in a small American town where opportunities were few and survival was the only dream most people dared to chase. The eldest was David, strong, quiet, and responsible. He carried the weight of the family on his shoulders. David worked endless shifts in a warehouse, stacking boxes until his back hurt, always telling himself this was just the way life was. The middle brother was Mark. Restless and outspoken, he did construction jobs, whatever work came his way. Mark was sharp but bitter. He believed the world was rigged against them, and no matter how hard they tried, they'd always be stuck at the bottom. And then there was Ethan, the youngest. He didn't have David's strength, nor Mark's sharp tongue. In fact, Ethan seemed like the one least likely to change anything. But Ethan had something the others didn't. He had vision. Every night, after the grind of daily labor, while David collapsed into bed and Mark drowned his frustration in complaints, Ethan sat quietly, sometimes by the dim light of a cracked lamp, sometimes with nothing but the night sky above him. He would imagine. He pictured a different life, a house filled with warmth instead of broken walls, a reliable car parked outside instead of the rusted old one they pushed more than they drove. He imagined his mother smiling again, free from constant worry. He saw freedom, abundance, purpose. To David and Mark, he was just a dreamer. "Wake up, Ethan," Mark would snap. "Dreams don't pay the bills." Even David, though gentler, would shake his head and mutter, "You've got to be realistic." But Ethan refused to let go of what he saw in his mind, because deep down he believed something powerful. The life you live is created twice, first in your imagination, then in reality. At first, nothing seemed different. The jobs were the same, the money still short, the struggles still heavy. But then, small shifts began. A chance encounter. A surprising opportunity. Doors opening where none had existed before. Were they just coincidences? Or were they the first signs that Ethan's vision was taking root in reality? This book tells that story. The raw, unfiltered journey of three brothers, David, Mark, and Ethan. One who settled, one who complained, and one who believed. And how the youngest of them, against all odds, turned his vision into reality. But this isn't only their story. Woven into it is a blueprint you can follow, a set of principles showing you how to shape your own reality no matter where you start. Because manifestation isn't magic, it's alignment, a union of thought, belief, and action. So before we begin, I'll ask you this. What if the only thing standing between you and the life you've always wanted is your willingness to believe it's possible? Welcome to From Vision to Reality, the Manifestation Blueprint. And if you find inspiration in stories like this, where wisdom meets real human struggle, then make sure you subscribe to The Wise Book Voice, because this is just the beginning, and there are many more journeys, lessons, and voices waiting to guide you. Chapter 1. The Weight of Reality. Every morning began the same. The alarm would buzz before sunrise, the house cold, the fridge nearly empty. David would lace up his worn-out boots, preparing for another back-breaking shift. Mark would grumble, dragging himself to whichever site had hired him that week. Ethan, too, would leave for odd jobs, stocking shelves, unloading trucks, mowing lawns. Their wages, combined, barely kept the household afloat. Rent was late more often than not. Dinner was sometimes nothing more than canned soup and stale bread. Nights were filled with arguments, David lecturing about responsibility, Mark snapping back with his bitterness, Ethan mostly quiet, staring off into the distance as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. To outsiders, they were just another struggling family. Nothing special, nothing different, and in many ways, David and Mark believed that was true. This is who we are. This is all we'll ever be. But Ethan felt different. While his brothers surrendered to exhaustion, Ethan's mind refused to rest. He would lie awake at night, staring at the cracked ceiling, imagining a life that felt worlds away from his reality. He pictured a home that didn't leak when it rained, one with warmth and light and laughter. He imagined driving a car that didn't break down every other week. He saw himself building something meaningful, something that gave him freedom, not just for himself, but for David and Mark too. It wasn't just wishful thinking. Ethan could feel it. In his mind, the images were so vivid they felt real. He could almost smell the fresh paint in that new house, hear the engine of that car humming smoothly, see his brothers finally smiling without the weight of struggle. But when he spoke of these visions, he was met with disbelief. Mark laughed at him. "Dreams don't pay the bills, Ethan. Wake up. You're just setting yourself up for disappointment." Even David, kinder in tone, would shake his head. "You've got to be realistic, kid. Wishing for more doesn't make it happen." And maybe they were right. Maybe dreams were just illusions, pretty distractions from a harsh reality. But something inside Ethan refused to accept that. Deep down, he believed what his brothers couldn't, that the life you live is created twice, once in your imagination and then in the real world. Still, belief alone didn't change the fact that the next morning, Ethan was back at the loading dock, sweating for hours and earning barely enough for gas. The gap between his visions and his reality was wide, so wide it almost seemed foolish to believe it could ever close. But here's the thing. The seeds of change are often invisible at first. They don't announce themselves with fireworks. They whisper. And while David and Mark saw nothing but the same cycle, Ethan had already begun planting seeds that would grow into something none of them could have imagined. The tension between the brothers grew sharper with time. David grew tired of being the responsible one, frustrated by bills that never seemed to shrink. Mark grew angrier, convinced that fate had cursed them. And Ethan, though he kept quiet, carried a secret determination that one day he'd prove them wrong, not with arguments, but with results. There was a night when it all boiled over. The three sat in their cramped kitchen, a single bulb flickering above. David had just laid out the bills on the table, his forehead pressed against his hands. Mark leaned back, arms crossed, bitterness dripping from his voice. "We're drowning," Mark spat. "And this kid," he pointed at Ethan, "sits there dreaming about mansions and cars like some fairy tale." Ethan's eyes didn't flinch. "It's not a fairy tale, Mark. It's possible. I know it." Mark scoffed. "Know it? Look around you. This is reality, Ethan. This is life. Some people get lucky. We don't." David sighed, too tired to argue. "He's young, Mark. Let him dream. Maybe someday he'll understand." But Ethan wasn't just dreaming. He was preparing. Quietly, Privately, he had already begun shaping his life in ways his brothers couldn't see. For now, though, the house stayed cold, the bills piled up, and the brothers remained stuck. To David and Mark, nothing was changing. Nothing ever would. But Ethan saw more. Every night, while his brothers gave in to exhaustion, Ethan sat in silence, closing his eyes, seeing a life so much bigger than the one they were living. A life of abundance, freedom, and joy. And though no one else believed him, he believed enough for all three. What he didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that this belief was about to set into motion a chain of events that would change everything. Chapter 2. The Dreamer's Fire. The night was heavy and silent in the small countryside town. Crickets hummed outside, and the faint glow of an oil lamp flickered against the cracked wooden walls of the brothers' house. David and Mark were fast asleep after a long day of grueling labor. Their snores echoed softly through the thin walls. But Ethan was wide awake. He lay on his old, creaking bed, staring up at the ceiling where shadows danced. Most people in his situation would have closed their eyes, surrendering to exhaustion. But Ethan's mind was restless, burning with something neither of his brothers could see nor understand. And that something was fire. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that creates. The kind that pushes a man beyond the weight of his reality. What makes a man different from the world around him? Is it luck? Talent? Education? No. Ethan believed it was vision. While his brothers saw the cracked walls and unpaid bills, Ethan saw something no one else dared to imagine. A future so bright it scared him. And every night, when the world went quiet, he lit that fire again in his heart, stoking the flames of dreams that seemed impossible. But to Ethan, impossible was just another word for not yet. David, the eldest, always said, "You can't waste time dreaming when there's bread to earn." Mark, the middle brother, would snap, "Wake up, Ethan. Nobody in this town makes it out. This is our life. Accept it." But Ethan couldn't accept it. He refused to. He saw himself in another life. He saw a house that wasn't falling apart, clothes that weren't patched 100 times, a car that didn't rattle with every turn. He saw himself free from the chains of wages and debts. He saw his brothers living better too, even if they didn't believe it now. The images in his mind were so vivid, so alive, that they felt more real to him than the broken floorboards beneath his feet. One night, Ethan did something unusual. He took an old notebook, one Mark had left behind from school years ago, and opened it. On the first page, with a shaky hand, he wrote, "My life as it will be." Then, beneath it, he listed everything he saw in his mind. A home filled with light, laughter, and warmth. Financial freedom. His brothers happy, no longer slaves to wages. A life where choice replaced survival. When he finished, he closed his eyes, and in the silence, he imagined himself living that life. He pictured walking through the halls of that new home. He pictured the smell of fresh wood and the sound of his brother's laughter. He felt the steering wheel of a brand new car in his hands. It wasn't just imagination, it was manifestation in motion. Ethan didn't know the term, he didn't know the science, but he knew that if he could see it and feel it, then somehow, someday, he could become it. And that belief set him apart from David and Mark. Of course, dreams attract resistance. One morning, Mark found Ethan's notebook on the table. He flipped through the pages, scoffing. "What is this nonsense? A mansion? A car? You think writing this down is going to change anything?" Ethan calmly replied, "I'm not just writing, Mark. I'm building. Every word, every picture, it's a brick in the life I'm creating." David laughed wearily. "Bricks don't pay bills, Ethan. Sweat does. You should come to work with us instead of wasting your nights scribbling fantasies." But Ethan only smiled. "One day you'll see. What I imagine today will become tomorrow's reality." They shook their heads, muttering how their youngest brother was lost in dreams. But Ethan didn't mind. He wasn't asking for their belief. He only needed his own. Night after night, Ethan returned to his ritual. He wrote more details. He visualized with more clarity. And here's the secret he discovered. The more he imagined, the more real it felt. His brain began to accept the vision as truth. His body began to act with quiet confidence. His energy shifted. At work, though he earned the same pitiful wages, he carried himself differently. While David groaned under the weight of crates and Mark cursed the heat, his eyes were fixed on something beyond. Coworkers noticed. "Why is he always smiling? Doesn't he know he's just like the rest of us?" But Ethan wasn't just like the rest. He was a man with fire inside him. Here's the thing most people miss. The world doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what you expect. And Ethan expected more. He didn't bow to the circumstances around him. He let the circumstances bend to the power of his vision. When he walked home on that dusty road, he didn't just see broken fences and rusting cars. He saw stepping stones. He whispered to himself, "This is temporary. My future is waiting. I can feel it." And every time he whispered it, that fire grew brighter. Of course, the gap between the brothers grew. David became more practical, Mark more bitter. They began to resent Ethan's lightheartedness. "You act like you're above all this," Mark snapped one evening. "No," Ethan replied softly. "I just see what's beyond this." David sighed wearily. "Dreams don't feed hungry mouths." Ethan looked him in the eye. "Neither does hopelessness." The house went quiet after that. There are moments in life when belief feels foolish. Ethan lived in that space daily, mocked by his brothers, doubted by everyone. But deep down, he knew. He knew something they didn't. The future doesn't wait for permission. It waits for courage. And while David and Mark's courage had long been buried under the weight of reality, Ethan's courage was growing. Soon, it would burst into something undeniable. One night, Ethan stood outside, staring at the stars. The village was asleep, but in his heart, the fire was wide awake. He whispered a promise to himself. "One day I'll show them all, not with words, with results." And as he closed his notebook that night, something shifted. He didn't know it yet, but that small act, the consistent, quiet ritual of belief, was the seed of everything to come. Because belief, once planted, doesn't stay hidden forever. It grows, and one day it breaks through the soil for everyone to see. Chapter 3. Sparks of Belief. The sun rose over the small village, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Roosters crowed, neighbors shuffled to their fields, and smoke curled from the chimneys of worn-down homes. For most people, it was just another day, a repeat of the same struggles, the same routines. But for Ethan, this day felt different. Belief is a strange thing. It doesn't shout, It doesn't knock at your door. It comes quietly, like a spark in the dark, small, almost invisible. But once lit, it has the power to ignite a fire that can change everything. Ethan had carried his vision silently for weeks. His brothers mocked him, the townsfolk dismissed him, and yet he persisted. But now something began to shift. For the first time, the outside world gave a tiny nod to the reality Ethan carried inside. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. One afternoon, Ethan walked to the village market. The air smelled of baked bread and dust, and merchants shouted about fresh vegetables, hand-woven baskets, and second-hand clothes. Ethan didn't have much money, but he carried his notebook with him, as always. At a small corner, he stopped near a stall of books. Old, worn, half-torn novels and journals sat stacked in piles. Nobody really cared about books here. Survival left little room for stories. But Ethan's eyes lit up. He picked up a thin book, its cover faded. The title read, "The Power of the Mind." He flipped through it quickly. Though some pages were missing, one sentence stood out. What you hold in your mind long enough, with enough conviction, must eventually appear in your life. Ethan's hands trembled slightly. It was as if the book was speaking to him directly, confirming everything he had been practicing. The merchant chuckled. "That old thing? Worthless. I'll give it to you for a coin." Ethan paid without hesitation. For him, it wasn't just a book. It was a sign. That night, Ethan sat under the dim oil lamp, reading the book as though it were sacred scripture. David returned from work, sweaty and exhausted. Mark followed, his face sour, as always. "What now?" Mark asked, noticing the little book. Ethan smiled. "It says here, the mind is the key. If you can hold the vision, it will come to life." Mark burst out laughing. "You mean if I sit here and imagine a feast, food will appear on the table?" David shook his head. "Don't fill yourself with false hope, Ethan. Hard work, that's what puts bread here, not words." Ethan closed the book gently and looked at them both. "You're right. Bread comes from hard work, but the life I want, the future I see, that doesn't come from labor alone. It comes from belief. Labor without vision is slavery, but vision with labor is freedom." For a moment, neither brother replied. David just sighed and went to bed. Mark muttered under his breath, "Dreamer." But deep down, something in David stirred. He didn't admit it out loud, but Ethan's confidence was beginning to unsettle him. Days passed. Ethan continued his rituals, writing, visualizing, whispering affirmations into the quiet night. And then, little by little, life responded. One day, he found an old friend in town who offered him a small side job that paid better than the grueling labor at the mill. Another time, he overheard a merchant talking about opportunities in a nearby city, something that lodged itself in Ethan's heart like a beacon. And on some nights, when money seemed impossibly tight, unexpected kindness arrived, a neighbor bringing leftover bread, or a stranger offering a ride. To his brothers, these were coincidences, but to Ethan, they were sparks, signs that his vision was beginning to breathe. Here's the truth about manifestation most people ignore. Before your life changes, you must change. Ethan noticed it.
He no longer complained about long hours. He carried himself with quiet dignity, even in ragged clothes. His shoulders stood straighter, his eyes looked clearer. While others dragged themselves through the mud of daily life, Ethan walked as though he was already living his future. And people noticed. The merchant at the market once said, "You carry yourself differently, boy, like you're expecting something." Ethan simply smiled. "I am." One evening, as David sat at the table, he muttered, "Strange thing happened today. The foreman said we might get more work next season, more pay maybe." Mark shrugged. Lucky break. But David looked at Ethan, really looked at him. Funny thing is, Ethan said something like this would happen. Mark scoffed. "Don't start with that nonsense." But Ethan just smiled softly and said, "When you believe, life arranges itself." David didn't admit it out loud, but for the first time, he wondered, could his younger brother be on to something? That night, Ethan lay in bed holding his notebook close to his chest. For weeks he had been building visions in silence, fighting ridicule, trusting an unseen future. And now, finally, the world had begun to whisper back. The sparks were faint, yes, but sparks have only one destiny: to grow into flames.
Chapter 4. The Doubt and the Struggle. The village was quiet that winter. Too quiet. Fields lay frozen, work slowed to a crawl, and the mill cut hours for nearly everyone. Food grew scarcer, and so did hope. Here's the thing nobody tells you about manifestation. The moment you start believing, life will push back. Not because the vision is wrong, but because it wants to know if you truly mean it. Doubt doesn't come to destroy you, it comes to test your strength. And for Ethan, the test had arrived. Days turned darker, winds howled through the cracks in their old wooden home, and every morning, frost lined the windows. David worked fewer shifts. Mark complained more than ever. "Your dreams won't feed us, Ethan," Mark snapped one evening as they sat around the table with little more than boiled potatoes. "We need real answers, not fantasies written in that little book of yours." Ethan kept calm, though his heart was heavy. "This is temporary. The storm always comes before the harvest." Mark slammed his fist on the table. "Stop talking like a preacher. If you want to help, work harder, not dream harder." David, quieter than usual, said nothing, but Ethan saw the doubt returning to his eyes. Truth be told, Ethan himself was tired. His affirmations felt hollow some nights. His journal entries felt like empty words, and when the hunger gnawed in his stomach, his faith shook. Lying awake in the cold, he whispered to himself, "I'm destined for more. I am destined for more." But the silence of the night sometimes answered back, "Are you sure?" This was the dangerous place where most people quit. At the market, whispers followed Ethan now. "There's that dreamer boy," someone chuckled, "thinks he'll be rich by wishing on the stars. His brothers work hard. He just writes in a notebook." Ethan kept walking, but their words pierced deeper than he let show. It's one thing to face your brother's doubt. It's another to feel the whole village laughing. Still, he clutched his notebook tighter. One late evening, as the fire dimmed, David sat across from Ethan. "Tell me honestly, do you ever doubt yourself?" Ethan hesitated, then admitted, "Yes, every day. But then I remember, the doubt isn't the enemy, it's the proof. It means I'm stepping beyond what I've known. If I didn't feel doubt, it would mean I wasn't reaching far enough." David studied his brother's face. Ethan's eyes were tired, but there was still a strange light in them, a light David couldn't explain. Mark, overhearing, scoffed. "Light won't put food in our stomach." But David said nothing. For the first time, he wasn't sure if Mark was right. One night, a storm hit the village. Winds rattled the roof and rain seeped through cracks in the walls. Ethan lay awake, shivering, staring at the notebook on the table. For the first time, he almost gave in. He almost believed Mark. He almost threw the book into the fire and said, "Enough. Maybe this is foolishness." His hand hovered over the notebook. His chest tightened. And then he remembered the line from the book he bought at the market. "What you hold in your mind long enough, with enough conviction, must eventually appear in your life." He whispered it out loud, then again and again until his trembling slowed. He closed his eyes and saw the vision, the better life, the city, the abundance, the peace. And in that storm, when doubt nearly consumed him, he chose belief again. The next morning, David found Ethan asleep at the table, his head resting on the open notebook. His lips still murmured faint words of affirmation in his dreams. David touched the worn pages. Drawings of houses, words of abundance, lists of goals filled the journal. It wasn't just fantasy. It was Ethan's entire soul written on paper. For the first time, David felt respect. Quiet, hesitant respect. He thought to himself, what if he's not crazy? What if he's on to something we can't see yet? The winter dragged on. Struggles grew heavier, but through every storm, Ethan's flame refused to die. And David, though silent, was no longer laughing. He was watching, and watching closely. Because sometimes the line between foolishness and vision isn't clear until one day the impossible begins to happen. Chapter 5. The Shift in Reality. The first hints of spring crept into the village. Snow melted into streams that ran through muddy paths. Fields began to breathe again. The air, still cold, carried the faint promise of warmth. And with that change outside, something began to shift inside too. Every dreamer waits for this moment, the moment when the inner belief finally collides with outer reality. For Ethan, this was the turning point. One morning, as Ethan walked to the village square, he overheard two merchants talking. "The mill's hiring again. They're looking for someone who can read and keep simple accounts." Ethan froze. Reading? Accounts? All those nights studying that little book? All those pages of affirmations and writings? Suddenly, they didn't feel useless anymore. With a burst of courage, he approached the merchant. "I can read," Ethan said firmly. "I can do numbers." The merchant raised an eyebrow. "You? You're a day laborer." "Yes," Ethan admitted, "but I've prepared for more." The man smirked, unconvinced, but finally shrugged. "Fine, the supervisor will test you tomorrow. Don't waste his time." That night, Ethan told David and Mark.
Mark burst out laughing. You? An accountant? What's next? You'll run the mill itself? Ethan stayed calm. You'll see. David, though doubtful, looked thoughtful. If they test you, can you really pass? Ethan smiled. I've been preparing all my life. I just didn't know it until now. The next day, Ethan stood before the mill supervisor. The man handed him a ledger filled with rows of numbers. Add the totals. Balance the accounts. His hands shook at first, but as he focused, everything clicked. He remembered the discipline he'd built from writing, affirming, and visualizing. His mind was sharper than ever. Minutes passed. Ethan worked calmly, steadily. Finally, he handed the ledger back. The supervisor glanced through it, his brows lifted. Not bad. Not bad at all. When can you start? Ethan's chest swelled with pride. Today. Weeks later, Ethan brought home his first wages from the mill's accounting job. It wasn't riches, but it was steady, better than day labor, and more respected. Mark stared at the coins on the table, his jaw tight. You actually did it. Ethan looked at his brothers, his voice steady. This is just the beginning. I told you, the mind creates the path before the feet walk it. David nodded slowly, almost whispering. Maybe you're right. Something changed in the household. The food portions grew larger, the firewood pile didn't run out as quickly. The home, once silent with despair, carried laughter again. And most importantly, David began asking questions. What do you write in that notebook? What do you tell yourself every morning? Can you teach me too? Ethan smiled. It starts with one thing, belief. Once you believe, the world bends. Mark rolled his eyes but said nothing. Yet in the quiet of the night, even Mark couldn't ignore what he saw. Ethan's dreams were no longer just dreams. They were becoming real. At the market, whispers changed. Isn't that Ethan? Didn't he get hired at the mill? Strange. I thought he was just a dreamer. Maybe there's more to him than we thought. For the first time, the laughter turned into curiosity, and curiosity into respect. One evening, David watched Ethan writing in his journal. What are you writing now? He asked. Ethan replied, The next chapter of my life. I see myself leading, owning, creating. Bigger things are coming. David sat in silence. Something stirred in him, a small spark. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder, what if I dared to dream too? Mark, standing by the doorway, scoffed, but this time his voice lacked conviction. Because deep down, even Mark couldn't ignore the shift. The tide had turned. Ethan had gone from mocked dreamer to proof that vision could manifest into reality. But this was only the beginning. The village had seen his rise. His brothers had witnessed his transformation. The question now was, how far could this go? And Ethan already knew his answer. As far as I choose.
Chapter 6. The Breakthrough. The summer sun was merciless that year. Fields shimmered in heat, and the air smelled of dust and sweat. Yet inside Ethan's heart, something entirely different burned, a quiet fire of certainty. He knew something big was coming. He had written about it, dreamed of it, spoken it into existence. And now he could feel the world rearranging itself to deliver. It's one thing to believe in silence. It's another when the world tests if your belief can truly stand. This was the moment Ethan had been waiting for, his greatest test and his greatest chance. One afternoon, word spread across the village. A wealthy landowner from the nearby city was seeking someone trustworthy to manage a new grain trade route. The job promised not just wages, but leadership, influence, and the chance to step into a life beyond the village's borders. Most men dismissed the idea. That's for educated people, for city folks, not for us. But Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. This was the very opportunity he had envisioned for months. The role he had described in his notebook. The image he had replayed in his mind over and over. That night, Ethan spoke to his brothers. "I'm going to the city to meet the landowner." Mark scoffed instantly. "Are you insane? We barely survive here, and you think they'll hand you a trade route? You'll embarrass yourself." But David hesitated. He looked at Ethan's calm, steady eyes and said softly, "You really believe this is for you, don't you?" Ethan nodded. "Not believe, I know." The next morning, Ethan set out. Dust rose behind his boots as he walked the long road to the city. Along the way, he repeated his affirmations. "I am ready. I am capable. The opportunity is mine." With each step, his certainty grew. By the time the city walls rose before him, Ethan no longer felt like a poor laborer. He felt like a man stepping into his destiny. The landowner was a stern man with sharp eyes. He studied Ethan as if weighing his soul. "Why should I trust you with my business?" he asked. Ethan didn't flinch. "Because I see beyond coins and grain. I see growth, stability, and opportunity. I don't just want a job. I want to help you build something greater." The room fell silent. Then the landowner leaned back, a faint smile tugging his lips. "You speak like a man who already owns it. Fine. I'll give you a trial. Manage the next shipment. If it succeeds, the position is yours." The shipment was no small task. Merchants were skeptical. Workers doubted Ethan. Even Mark, when he heard the news, shook his head. "This will be the end of your foolish dreams." But David, for the first time, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I believe in you." That belief fueled Ethan more than anything. He organized, planned, double-checked every detail. When obstacles came, late carts, missing workers, arguments between merchants, Ethan remained calm. He leaned on the vision he had carried for years, the inner certainty that no storm could shake it. Days later, when the shipment reached its destination flawlessly, the landowner's men were stunned. Not a single error, not a single loss. The landowner summoned Ethan. "You've done what few men in this city could manage. From this day forward, you're in charge of the trade. The profits will be shared with you. Earn my trust, and you'll have more than you ever imagined." Ethan bowed his head, but inside he smiled, because this moment was no accident. It was the harvest of every dream he had planted, every word he had spoken into the quiet nights. When Ethan returned to the village, he wasn't carrying coins. He was carrying proof. Contracts, letters with the landowner's seal. An opportunity that would lift not just him, but his entire family out of poverty. Mark stared, stunned. This isn't possible. Not for us. Not for people like us." Ethan looked at him firmly. "It's possible for anyone who dares to see it before it exists. That's the secret you never believed in." David's eyes filled with tears. "You were right all along. belief isn't a dream, it's power. And for the first time, both brothers sat in silence, not mocking, not doubting, only humbled by the reality Ethan had created. The village had laughed, his brothers had doubted, the world had tested him. And yet Ethan stood at the edge of transformation, not just for himself, but for everyone connected to him. The boy who once labored for pennies was now the man shaping futures. But this was not the end. It was the beginning of a new destiny.
Conclusion: the manifestation realized. The village was no longer the same. Where once fields stood barren and families struggled with scraps, now trade routes brought in prosperity. Grain carts rolled steadily, workers found consistent pay, and children laughed with full bellies. And at the center of it all stood Ethan. Some stories remain ideas. Some dreams die in silence. But this one walked from vision into reality, and no one who witnessed it could ever deny the truth. Months after Ethan had taken charge of the trade, the landowner himself visited the village. He praised Ethan publicly, handing him a sealed letter declaring him chief overseer of the trade routes. The crowd cheered. For the first time, the brothers Mark and David watched as their younger brother stood honored in front of the very people who once mocked his nonsense dreams. That night, the three brothers sat together outside their old home. The silence was heavy, but not with judgment, rather with realization. Mark was the first to speak, his voice rough. "I spent years laughing at you. I told you that dreams were useless. But now, look around. You've done what I never even dared to imagine. You proved me wrong." Ethan didn't gloat. He simply smiled softly. "I didn't prove you wrong, Mark. I proved that reality listens when you dare to speak with faith." David's eyes glistened as he added, "I thought you were naive. But now, I see you were brave. You believed for all of us when we didn't believe for ourselves." For the first time, the brothers didn't see Ethan as the youngest dreamer. They saw him as the visionary who changed the destiny of their family. The lesson. Ethan leaned back, looking at the starlit sky. "You know what I've learned? The world doesn't reward those who only work with their hands. It rewards those who first work with their minds. What you think, what you expect, that's the seed. Everything else grows from there." The words settled into Mark and David like roots taking hold. For years they had lived in survival mode, never daring to want more. But now, sitting beside the brother who had turned belief into abundance, they felt the spark ignite within them. Years later, the story of Ethan wasn't just known in their small village. Traders spoke of him across towns, merchants trusted his name, and children grew up hearing the tale of the man who dreamed when no one else dared. Mark eventually started his own business inspired by Ethan's persistence. David became his closest partner in the trade, finally stepping into the vision he once doubted. But Ethan? He never stopped manifesting. Every success became a stepping stone to something greater.